The cantina on Nexus Station buzzed with the usual mixture of alien languages and synthetic alcohol fumes. Commander sat hunched over his third glass of fermented kelp extract, his forearms trembling slightly as memories flickered behind his compound eyes. The veteran mantoid had seen more battles than most species lived standard cycles, but tonight felt different. Tonight, the ghosts of dead humans haunted his thoughts. A young crystalline journalist named Ra approached his table, her translucent form shimmering with nervous energy. She had been pestering him for weeks about an interview regarding his experiences in the Void Wars. Most veterans refused to speak about those dark times, but felt the weight of truth pressing against his thoracic plates. "Commander," Ra said, her voice creating harmonious chimes in the air. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. The Galactic Council wants to understand what really happened during humanity's integration period." His mandibles clicked in what other species had learned was amusement, though it sounded more like grinding metal. Integration period, such a sanitized term for what we witnessed. He gestured with one of his secondary arms toward an empty chair. "Sit, young one. Let me tell you about the day I learned to fear a species that barely reached my knee joints." The journalist activated her recording crystals and settled into the chair, which adjusted automatically to accommodate her unique physiology. Around them, the cantina's patrons continued their conversations, unaware that they were about to hear a story that would reshape their understanding of galactic power dynamics. 15 cycles ago," began, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated battlefield wisdom, "I commanded the 47th Deep Strike Battalion of the Hegemony Defense Force. We were elite troops, genetically enhanced, cybernetically augmented, trained from birth to be the perfect soldiers. Each of us stood 3 meters tall, possessed natural armor plating, and could survive in the vacuum of space for limited periods." He paused to take another drink, the bioluminescent patterns on his carapace dimming with the memory. The Hegemony Council had just discovered a small blue world in the outer spiral arm. Initial scans showed a developing civilization, barely past their industrial age. Chemical rockets, primitive nuclear weapons, basic telecommunications. By all galactic standards, they were infants playing with dangerous toys. Ra leaned forward, her crystalline structure refracting the cantina's mood, lighting into rainbow patterns. But something was different about these humans, wasn't it? Different? His laugh was like breaking glass. "Child, that word doesn't begin to cover what we found. The initial contact team consisted of 3 diplomatic vessels, each carrying a full complement of peacekeeping forces. Standard procedure for integrating a new species into the galactic community. We expected gratitude, perhaps some initial resistance from their governments, but nothing our advanced technology couldn't overcome peacefully." The veteran's primary eyes focused on something beyond the cantina walls, beyond the space station, perhaps beyond time itself. The first team landed in what the humans called North America, near one of their major population centers. Our cultural analysts had identified this region as having relatively stable governmental structures and advanced technological development, perfect for a peaceful first contact scenario. "What went wrong?" Ra asked, though her species' natural empathic abilities already detected the profound trauma radiating from the old soldier. "Nothing went wrong exactly. That was the problem. Everything went according to plan until we discovered that humans don't follow anyone else's plans." Secondary arms began manipulating a small device, a nervous habit he'd developed since the wars. The first meeting took place in what they called the United Nations building. Representatives from most of their major governmental bodies were present. Our diplomatic corps delivered the standard integration speech, offered advanced technology, medical knowledge, peaceful coexistence under hegemony protection. He drained his glass and signaled for another. The human response was polite, measured, diplomatic. They asked for time to consider our offer, to consult with their various nations and cultures. Perfectly reasonable. We established a temporary base in their solar system's asteroid belt and waited for their decision. The new drink arrived, served by a 6-armed servitor unit whose species had been integrated into the hegemony 3 centuries ago. Barely noticed the server, lost in his recollections. During the waiting period, our intelligence division conducted routine surveillance of human activities. Standard procedure, nothing invasive, just monitoring their communication networks and observing their societal structures. What we found every model our had developed. Ra's recording crystals pulsed brighter, sensing the importance of what was coming. They were more advanced than you thought. No, they were exactly as primitive as our scans indicated. Chemical rockets, nuclear fission, basic computers. But the way they used these primitive tools, the way they thought about conflict and survival, it was unlike anything in our databases. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing the journalist to lean closer. We monitored their entertainment media, their historical records, their military training exercises. Every other species we'd encountered had developed technology first, then adapted their thinking to match their capabilities. Humans had done the opposite. They had developed predator thinking patterns that exceeded their technological reach by. The cantina's ambient noise seemed to fade as other patrons unconsciously tuned into the conversation. Stories of the legendary human conflicts were rare, usually dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration. Their military strategists were discussing scenarios that our best tactical computers couldn't model. They planned for conflicts spanning decades, across multiple star systems, using resources they hadn't even discovered yet. They debated the ethics of weapons they couldn't build and prepared contingencies for wars against enemies they'd never met. Bioluminescent patches flickered in patterns that translated roughly to profound unease. But the truly terrifying part wasn't their strategic thinking. It was their individual psychology. Every human we observed carried within them the capacity for extreme violence, coupled with an equally extreme capacity for sacrifice. They called it their fight or flight response, but our analysts realized it was something far more dangerous. More dangerous how? Ra prompted. Because humans don't choose fight or flight. They choose fight and flight, simultaneously. They would attack enemies stronger than themselves while protecting allies weaker than themselves, often during the same engagement. They made tactical decisions that violated every principle of self-preservation we understood. The veteran stood abruptly, his massive frame casting shadows across nearby tables. "Come with me. There's something I need to show you." They made their way through the station's corridors toward the military memorial wing. Heavy footsteps echoed off the metal deck plating, each step seeming to carry the weight of unspoken stories. "The memorial here contains records from every major conflict in galactic history," he explained as they walked. "But there's one section that most species avoid. The humans insisted it be included when they joined the galactic community." They arrived at a circular chamber filled with holographic displays and data crystals. Led her to a section marked with warning symbols in dozens of languages. The displays here showed footage from various human conflicts throughout their history. "Watch this," he said, activating a particular recording. "This is from their Second World War, fought entirely with chemical explosives and projectile weapons. Watch how they behave under pressure." The hologram showed human soldiers advancing across a battlefield despite overwhelming enemy fire. Some fell, others continued. When their objectives required sacrifice, they made it willingly. When their comrades needed rescue, they provided it regardless of personal cost. "Every species develops differently," continued, "but most follow predictable patterns. Fear motivates retreat, pain discourages repetition, death threats inspire surrender. Humans seemed immune to these basic survival instincts." Another recording activated, showing human pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into enemy targets. They called these kamikaze attacks, but the name doesn't translate the psychological component. These humans weren't suicidal or mentally unstable. They were making rational tactical decisions based on their assessment of acceptable losses versus strategic gains. Ra watched in fascination and horror as recording after recording showed similar patterns. Humans consistently chose courses of action that prioritized mission success over personal survival, that valued abstract concepts like freedom and justice over immediate physical safety. "Now you begin to understand what we faced during first contact," said. "We thought we were dealing with a primitive species that would be grateful for our guidance and protection. Instead, we encountered a race of apex predators who had been preparing for interstellar warfare since before they developed spaceflight." They returned to the cantina, where drink waited exactly as he'd left it. The cooling system had maintained its temperature perfectly, but the veteran barely noticed such technological conveniences anymore. After 6 months of observation, the Hegemony Council decided to accelerate the integration process. The humans had been taking too long to reach a decision, and were concerned about the cultural contamination that prolonged exposure to galactic civilization might cause. He settled back into his chair, his massive frame making the furniture creak despite its robust construction. The council authorized what they called a demonstration of superior capability. Nothing aggressive, just a display of our technological advantages designed to help the humans understand their place in the galactic hierarchy. Standard procedure? Ra asked. Completely standard. We've done it hundreds of times with other species. A few ships in their upper atmosphere, maybe disable some of their satellite networks temporarily, demonstrate our defensive capabilities. Usually results in immediate cooperation and gratitude for our benevolent approach. Slav this time held no humor whatsoever. The demonstration lasted exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. In that time, humanity taught the hegemony why they had survived as an apex predator species on a world that actively tried to kill them for millions of years. The veteran's 4 eyes focused on different points around the cantina, a defensive posture his species adopted when recalling particularly traumatic events. The moment our ships, human military forces around their planet went to maximum alert, not surrender protocols, not negotiation postures, combat readiness. Every human with access to any kind of weapon system immediately began targeting our vessels. But their weapons were primitive, Ra protested. Surely they couldn't actually threaten hegemony ships. That's exactly what our captains thought, right up until the humans started demonstrating why predator intelligence evolves differently than prey intelligence. Activated a small personal display device, showing tactical readouts from that day. Within 3 minutes of our ships becoming visible, human forces had identified our approximate defensive capabilities, calculated the necessary force multipliers to overcome them, and began implementing those calculations. The display showed a 3-dimensional representation of Earth's orbital space, with hegemony vessels marked in blue and human responses in red. They couldn't hurt us directly, so they stopped trying. Instead, they began targeting things we couldn't afford to lose. Ra studied the tactical display with growing amazement. They went after your supply lines. Worse, they went after our assumptions. Manipulated the display, highlighting specific human actions during those 14 minutes. Human military strategists had apparently spent decades preparing for this exact scenario. They called it asymmetric warfare, and they had refined it to an art form. The display showed human forces launching simultaneous attacks against communication satellites, power grids, and transportation networks, but not their own infrastructure. They were targeting the systems that galactic civilization would need to establish administrative control over their world. They were making their planet ungovernable, explained. Every bridge we might need to move ground forces, every communication hub we might use to coordinate pacification efforts, every resource extraction point that would make their world valuable to the hegemony. They began systematically destroying anything that would make occupation profitable or practical. Ra's crystalline structure dimmed as she processed the implications. They were willing to destroy their own civilization to prevent integration. Not destroy, deny. There's a crucial difference. The veteran's patterns shifted to colors that roughly translated as grudging respect. They weren't acting out of desperation or irrationality. Every target they selected, every system they disabled, was chosen based on careful analysis of galactic administrative procedures they had observed during our 6 months of peaceful observation. The tactical display continued its replay, showing the escalating human response to the hegemony demonstration. By minute 7, they had figured out our communication protocols and begun broadcasting false commands on our frequencies. By minute 10, they had identified the composition of our hull materials and started manufacturing improvised weapons specifically designed to exploit structural weaknesses. In 10 minutes, Ra's voice carried harmonics of disbelief. Human cognitive architecture is unique, said carefully. Most species develop intelligence as a tool for solving environmental problems or improving social cooperation. Humans developed intelligence as a weapon. Every human mind is essentially a battlefield computer optimized for conflict scenarios. He gestured toward the memorial wing they just visited. Those historical records I showed you weren't aberrations or exceptional cases. They were normal human behavior under stress. When threatened, humans don't just fight back. They evolve, in real time, during combat. The veteran stood again, this time moving to one of the cantina's observation windows. Beyond the transparent aluminum, stars wheeled slowly as the station rotated to maintain artificial gravity. By minute 14, human forces had essentially eliminated our ability to administer their world without committing to a full military occupation. The cost-benefit analysis changed completely. Instead of gaining a grateful client species, we were looking at a prolonged conflict with an enemy that improved its capabilities faster than we could adapt our strategies. Turned back to face the journalist, all four of his eyes focusing on her with an intensity that made her crystalline structure resonate with harmonic feedback. At minute 14 and 37 seconds, the hegemony fleet received new orders from the Council. Immediate withdrawal to minimum safe distance. Abort integration procedures. Classify humanity as a Class 7 emergent threat and establish a monitoring perimeter. The silence that followed stretched long enough for the cantina's background noise to reassert itself. Other patrons had resumed their conversations, unaware that they had just heard the opening chapter of a story that would reshape their understanding of galactic power structures. "That was the day," said finally, "that a veteran commander with 40 years of successful integration missions learned to fear a species that hadn't even achieved faster-than-light travel." Ra's recording crystals continued their steady pulse, capturing not just words but the emotional resonances that gave them meaning. But that wasn't the end of it, was it? The old soldier's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or resignation. "Young one, that wasn't even the beginning. What I just told you was first contact. Wait until you hear what happened when the humans figured out we were still watching them." 3 years passed after the failed integration attempt, and Commander found himself assigned to the observation fleet maintaining the monitoring perimeter around Sol's system. The Hegemony Council had classified the mission as routine surveillance, but every veteran who'd witnessed the 14-minute demonstration understood the truth. They weren't monitoring humanity's development. They were maintaining a quarantine. The observation post occupied a hollowed-out asteroid in the belt, its sensors trained constantly on the third planet, and its increasingly active moon. What they recorded during those 3 years challenged every assumption the hegemony had made about technological development and species advancement. "The humans didn't just resume their normal activities after our withdrawal," continued, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated revelations. "They accelerated. Everything they had been doing before our arrival, they began doing faster, better, and with a focus that bordered on obsession." Ra consulted her notes, though her crystalline memory matrix had already recorded everything with perfect fidelity. "Our intelligence reports from that period mentioned unusual industrial activity." "Unusual doesn't begin to describe what we witnessed." Activated his personal display again, showing surveillance footage from those 3 years. "Within 6 months of our departure, human space launch activity increased by 400%. But they weren't just launching more missions. They were launching different kinds of missions." The display showed streams of data representing human spacecraft trajectories, manufacturing outputs, and resource allocation patterns. Before our arrival, their space program focused on scientific research and satellite deployment. After our departure, every mission had dual-purpose capabilities: scientific instruments that could function as sensor arrays, communication satellites designed with defensive capabilities, research stations that could serve as forward military bases. Ra studied the data streams with growing amazement. They were militarizing their entire space program. No, that would have been predictable and manageable. They were doing something far more dangerous. Manipulated the display to highlight specific patterns. They were optimizing their entire civilization for conflict with an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't reach, and barely understood. The surveillance data painted a picture of a species transforming itself with ruthless efficiency. Human governments had begun unprecedented levels of cooperation, sharing technology and resources in ways their history suggested should have been impossible. "Watch this timeline," said, pointing to a series of industrial markers. "Before our arrival, human nations competed with each other for resources and territorial advantages, standard behavior for a species that hadn't achieved planetary unity. After our departure, they maintained their political structures but began coordinating their strategic development as if controlled by a single intelligence." The evidence was undeniable. Human manufacturing had shifted focus from consumer goods to strategic materials. Their educational systems had been restructured to emphasize science, engineering, and strategic thinking. Even their entertainment media had evolved to explore themes of interstellar conflict and resistance against superior forces. They turned their entire culture into a weapon, observed. Not through authoritarian control or social engineering, but through voluntary coordination based on shared recognition of external threat. Every human on their planet became a potential soldier, scientist, or strategic resource. Ra's harmonic patterns shifted to frequencies associated with deep confusion. But why? They had demonstrated their ability to resist integration. The hegemony had withdrawn. They were safe. That's prey thinking, said gently. Prey species assume that demonstrating defensive capability will deter predators. Predator species assume that revealing your defensive capabilities to a superior enemy means they'll return with better tactics and overwhelming force. The veteran warrior's explanation sent resonant frequencies through Ra's crystalline structure. The concept of perpetual threat assessment was foreign to most galactic species, who typically resolved conflicts through negotiation or submission. The humans had analyzed our technology during those 14 minutes and reached conclusions that our own strategists hadn't considered. They understood that our withdrawal was temporary, that the hegemony would eventually return with different methods and greater force. So they began preparing for a war they knew was coming. Pulled up another display showing human technological development over the 3-year period. Their advancement rate was unprecedented in galactic records. Most species require centuries to progress from chemical rockets to fusion drives. Humans made the transition in 18 months. The data showed human scientists had somehow reverse-engineered principles of faster-than-light communication, from analyzing the brief transmissions they'd intercepted during the integration attempt. Their manufacturing had shifted to producing materials that didn't exist in their natural environment, but would be necessary for advanced starship construction. More disturbing was their strategic development. Human military academies began teaching courses in interstellar logistics, multi-system resource management, and warfare tactics. They were preparing to fight enemies they had never seen on battlefields they couldn't reach. Ra's recording crystals pulsed faster as the implications became clear. They were preparing to take the war to you. Exactly. While the Hegemony Council debated whether to authorize another integration attempt, human civilization was transforming itself into an interstellar military force. Its bioluminescent patterns dimmed to colors associated with profound unease. But the truly terrifying development wasn't their technology or their strategy. It was their psychology. He activated a new display showing intercepted human communications from that period. We monitored their civilian populations expecting to see fear, confusion, or demands for government protection. Instead, we found something unprecedented in galactic psychological profiles. The communications showed human civilians discussing the implications of alien contact with a mixture of excitement and grim determination. Children were learning advanced mathematics and physics as preparation for eventual space careers. Elderly humans were volunteering for experimental procedures designed to test human survivability in hostile environments. Every human on their planet had apparently decided that their species' survival required personal sacrifice and improvement. They weren't conscripted or coerced. They chose to transform themselves into something more dangerous than they had been before. Ross studied the psychological profiles with growing alarm. This kind of species-wide coordination usually requires hive mind development or authoritarian control. How were they managing it? Through what they called adaptive cooperation. Humans possess unusual social structures that allow independent decision-making while maintaining group objectives. Each individual could choose their own role in species defense while contributing to overall strategic goals. Paused to order another drink, though his consumption seemed motivated more by the need for ritual comfort than actual thirst. By the end of year 2, human capabilities had advanced to the point where our recommended immediate military intervention, not to integrate them into the hegemony, but to prevent them from developing into a strategic threat. The journalist leaned forward, her crystalline structure refracting the cantina's lights into complex patterns. What changed their minds? The humans figured out we were still watching them. The simple statement carried implications that sent harmonic resonances through Ra's entire structure. How? Predator intelligence, remember. Humans had been assuming we were maintaining surveillance and had spent 2 years analyzing every anomaly in their solar system. They identified our observation posts through gravitational analysis, electromagnetic signature detection, and simple logical deduction. Activated another display showing the moment human discovery became undeniable. At 14:37 Galactic Standard Time on day 847 post-withdrawal, every major human government simultaneously broadcast the same message on frequencies we had used during the integration attempt. The display showed the transmission, converted into harmonic patterns that Ra could understand. The message was simple, direct, and more threatening than any military ultimatum in galactic history. "We know you're watching. We know you'll be back. We're ready." 12 words said, 12 words that changed the strategic balance of the entire sector, because what made the message terrifying wasn't the content, it was the timing. Ra studied the transmission data, the timing. They sent it exactly 1,000 days after our initial withdrawal. Precisely, to the minute. The humans had been tracking our observation schedule and had calculated that day 1,000 would be psychologically significant to hegemony decision-makers. They were demonstrating not just awareness but psychological analysis of their enemies. The veteran's four arms gestured in patterns of deep respect mixed with existential dread. The message was accompanied by a comprehensive data package containing detailed technical specifications for every piece of hegemony technology they had observed during first contact. Not just what they had seen, but engineering analyses of how it worked and tactical assessments of how to defeat it. They had reverse-engineered your technology from passive observation. Worse, they had improved it. Patterns shifted to colors that didn't translate well into any known language, but conveyed something approaching religious awe. Human engineering teams had identified weaknesses in our designs that our own scientists hadn't noticed. They had developed theoretical improvements that our best researchers had declared impossible. The data package, according to the surveillance files, had contained detailed plans for human spacecraft designs that incorporated hybrid human hegemony technology. The ships were theoretically capable of faster-than-light travel, equipped with defensive systems based on improved versions of hegemony shields, and armed with weapons specifically designed to exploit the vulnerabilities humans had identified in alien ship construction. But the most disturbing element of their data package wasn't technological, continued. It was strategic. The humans had spent 3 years analyzing galactic civilization based on our behavior during first contact and had developed comprehensive intelligence profiles for every major species in the hegemony. Ra's harmonic output shifted to frequencies associated with deep confusion. Intelligence profiles based on what data? Based on analysis of our diplomatic procedures, our technological choices, our psychological responses to their resistance, and simple logical extrapolation. Explanation carried undertones of professional admiration. Humans had correctly identified the hierarchical structure of hegemony governance, predicted the likely species compositions of our military forces, and developed tactical counters for combat doctrines they had never observed. The surveillance data showed human analysts had somehow deduced that the hegemony relied heavily on technological superiority rather than tactical flexibility, that most member species had evolved from prey backgrounds and would respond predictably to certain types of pressure, and that the command structure prioritized administrative efficiency over strategic innovation. They were preparing to fight not just us, but our entire civilization, based on 14 minutes of first contact and 3 years of passive observation. Drink arrived, but he ignored it as the memories demanded his full attention. The data package included detailed war plans for scenarios ranging from diplomatic negotiation to full-scale interstellar conflict. They had prepared contingencies for everything from economic warfare to refugee evacuation to guerrilla campaigns across multiple star systems. Planning military campaigns against enemies they had never fought. Planning to win military campaigns against enemies they had never fought, corrected. Every scenario they outlined was designed not just to resist hegemony integration, but to actively defeat hegemony forces and potentially threaten hegemony member worlds. The veteran warrior paused to let the implications settle into Ra's crystalline consciousness. The humans had analyzed galactic civilization and concluded that the hegemony represented an existential threat not just to human independence, but to human survival. So they had decided to eliminate that threat permanently. Ra's recording crystals pulsed with harmonic patterns associated with deep alarm. They were planning to invade the hegemony. Planning, preparing, and according to their timeline, nearly ready to begin implementation. Finally picked up his drink, though his consumption was mechanical, distracted. The data package included a projected timeline for human readiness. They estimated 18 more months to achieve technological parity, 6 additional months for strategic positioning, and then active operations would commence. The surveillance files painted a picture of a species that had transformed itself from a primitive planetary civilization to an emerging interstellar threat in less than 3 years. Human shipyards were preparing to begin construction of vessels designed for interstellar warfare. Human military academies were graduating officers trained in tactics specifically designed to defeat hegemony forces. Human industrial capacity had been redirected toward supporting campaigns that would span multiple star systems and potentially last for decades. At that point, said, the Hegemony Council faced a choice that hadn't been necessary for over 6 centuries. For the first time since the hegemony's formation, we were confronting a species that posed a genuine strategic threat to galactic stability. Ra's harmonic output had shifted to frequencies associated with dawning comprehension. What did the Council decide? The veteran's mandibles clicked in patterns that might have been amusement or resignation. They decided to do something unprecedented in galactic history. They decided to negotiate. Negotiate? Not integration, not conquest, not even containment. Full diplomatic recognition of humanity as an independent strategic power, with territorial guarantees and mutual non-interference agreements. Bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors associated with ironic appreciation. The Hegemony Council essentially granted humanity the same status as established interstellar civilizations, based entirely on their potential threat capability rather than their actual achievements. The implications sent resonant harmonics through the Cantina's crystalline fixtures. They gave humans equal status without requiring them to prove their civilization's worthiness through the normal integration process. Humans had already proven their worthiness, observed, not through technological achievement or cultural sophistication, but through successful threat assessment and strategic preparation. They had demonstrated that attempting to force their integration would cost more than allowing their independence. Ra consulted her memory matrix, trying to process the unprecedented nature of what she was hearing. So the humans achieved independence through intimidation. No, said carefully. They achieved independence through competence. The intimidation was merely a byproduct of their tactical preparation. Humans hadn't set out to threaten the hegemony. They had simply prepared to defend themselves, and their preparations were so thorough and effective that they constituted a strategic threat. The veteran warrior stood once more, his massive frame casting familiar shadows as he moved toward the Cantina's central viewing area. The final negotiations took place in neutral space, midway between Sol's system and the nearest hegemony world. I was part of the security detail for our diplomatic team. His voice carried undertones of profound respect mixed with lasting unease. Meeting humans in person was educational. Everything our surveillance had recorded was accurate, but incomplete. Humans project an aura of controlled lethality that doesn't translate through electronic monitoring. Ra followed him to the viewing area, where stars wheeled slowly beyond the transparent aluminum barriers. What do you mean? Humans carry themselves like weapons that happen to be capable of conversation. Every movement is economical, purposeful, aware. They assess every environment for tactical advantages and strategic vulnerabilities. They evaluate every individual they encounter as either potential ally or potential threat. Explanation carried the weight of direct observation. But the most unnerving aspect of human psychology was their absolute confidence in their own capabilities. Overconfidence? No accurate assessment. The humans who came to negotiate had spent 4 years preparing for interstellar warfare. They understood their own strengths and limitations with precise clarity. They also understood ours. The veteran's patterns dimmed to colors associated with uncomfortable memories. The lead human negotiator was a female named Admiral. During the first session, she presented a tactical analysis of our security arrangements that was more accurate than our own briefings. Ra's harmonic output shifted to frequencies associated with incredulous alarm. She analyzed your security during the negotiations. She had analyzed our security before arriving at the negotiations. Human intelligence capabilities exceeded our estimates by several orders of magnitude. Admiral knew the names, species, and psychological profiles of every member of our diplomatic team. She had identified weaknesses in our escort ship's defensive configurations and had prepared countermeasures for every weapon system we had brought to the meeting. The implications continued to cascade through Vexara's consciousness like harmonic resonances in a crystalline matrix. The humans came to peace negotiations prepared for battle. Humans come to everything prepared for battle. That's what makes them such effective apex predators. This observation carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. But Admiral wasn't interested in fighting. She was interested in establishing mutual deterrence based on accurate threat assessment. The veteran activated his personal display one final time, showing the agreement that had emerged from those negotiations. The Treaty of Solar Independence, signed exactly 4 years and 14 minutes after the failed integration attempt. The timing was deliberate, of course. Humans don't forget significant moments, and they use symbolic precision as a form of psychological communication. The treaty terms, translated into harmonic frequencies that Ra could fully comprehend, were unlike anything in galactic diplomatic history. Humanity had been granted complete territorial sovereignty over their solar system, with rights to expansion and colonization that typically required centuries of proven galactic citizenship. In exchange, humans had agreed to limit their military development to defensive capabilities and to share certain technologies with the greater galactic community. But the most significant element of the treaty wasn't what humans gained, continued. It was what they offered in return. They volunteered to serve as a defensive force for smaller species threatened by external aggression. Ra's crystalline structure resonated with harmonic patterns of deep confusion. They offered to become protectors of other species. They had analyzed galactic civilization and identified a strategic weakness in the hegemony's defensive doctrine. Most member species had evolved beyond their aggressive instincts and relied on technological deterrence rather than tactical capability. When faced with truly hostile external forces, the hegemony struggled to mount effective resistance. The veteran's explanation painted a picture of humans serving as a kind of strategic immune system for galactic civilization, providing capabilities that more peaceful species had evolved beyond. Humans offered to fill that gap, to serve as specialist forces for situations requiring aggressive tactical responses. And the Hegemony Council accepted. Its mandibles clicked in what definitely sounded like ironic amusement. The Council didn't just accept, they were relieved. The Hegemony had been facing increasing pressure from hostile forces beyond the galactic rim, and our traditional defensive methods were proving inadequate. Suddenly, we had allies who specialized in exactly the kind of warfare we found most difficult. The Treaty of Solar Independence had essentially transformed humanity from a potential threat to a strategic asset, while preserving their independence and acknowledging their unique capabilities. It was, according to every diplomatic expert in the hegemony, the most successful negotiation in galactic history. Within 6 months of the treaty's signing, human military advisors were working with hegemony defense forces to develop new tactical doctrines. Human engineers were collaborating with alien scientists to improve defensive technologies. Human diplomats were representing hegemony interests in conflicts involving aggressive external species. Ra studied the treaty terms with growing amazement. So humans became equal partners in galactic governance without ever being integrated into the hegemony. Equal partners? No. Patterns shifted to colors that suggested profound respect. Superior partners in specific strategic areas, equal partners in general governance, and absolutely independent in their internal affairs. Humans had achieved something unprecedented in galactic history. They had negotiated a relationship based on mutual benefit rather than hierarchical integration. The veteran warrior finished his drink and prepared to return to their table. But that's only part of the story. The truly remarkable developments began after the treaty was signed, when humans started interacting regularly with other galactic species. As they settled back into their seats, Ra's recording crystals continued their steady documentation of what was clearly the most important historical testimony in recent galactic memory. What happened then? His 4 eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her crystalline structure resonate with harmonic feedback. Then we learned that everything we thought we understood about humans was merely the surface layer of a psychological architecture that every model of sapient development in our databases. The first joint operation between human forces and the Hegemony Defense Fleet occurred 8 months after the Treaty of Solar Independence was signed. A hostile species known as the Devourers had begun systematic attacks on colony worlds in the Outer Rim, using tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against traditional hegemony defensive strategies. Commander had requested assignment to the Joint Task Force, driven by a combination of professional curiosity and personal need to understand the allies who had once terrified him. What he discovered during that campaign fundamentally changed not only his understanding of human psychology, but his comprehension of what sapient life could become under the right evolutionary pressures. The Devourer attacks followed a predictable pattern, explained, his voice carrying the weight of tactical analysis refined through direct experience. They would emerge from hyperspace at maximum system range, conduct rapid reconnaissance using disposable probe units, then execute coordinated strikes against infrastructure targets while civilian evacuation was still in progress. Ra's crystalline structure pulsed with harmonic frequencies associated with combat stress, even though she was only hearing descriptions of battles fought years ago. Standard aggressive expansion tactics. Exactly standard, which was why hegemony forces struggled to counter them effectively. Our defensive doctrines are designed around negotiation, deterrence, and protective engagement. When faced with enemies who refuse communication and specialize in rapid, overwhelming force, our strategic options become limited. The veteran activated his personal display, showing tactical recordings from the first joint operation. The target was a mining colony in the system, population roughly 2 million across 3 planets and 17 orbital facilities. The Devourers had demonstrated they could reduce similar installations to debris fields within 6 hours of initial contact. The display showed the strategic setup. Hegemony forces positioned in traditional defensive formations around high-value targets, prepared to intercept incoming attacks and protect evacuation routes. Standard procedure, refined through centuries of successful defensive operations. The human contingent consisted of a single ship, the UES Retribution, carrying a crew of 800 and commanded by Admiral herself. When she arrived at the staging area and reviewed our defensive plan, her first words were, "Where are the attack formations?" Ra's harmonic output shifted to frequencies associated with confusion. "Attack formations? You were defending the colony." That's exactly what our tactical coordinator explained to Admiral. Her response was, "Defending means making the enemy pay a higher price for attacking than they're willing to pay. You can't do that from a defensive posture." Patterns shifted to colors that suggested profound admiration mixed with lasting bewilderment. She then presented an alternative strategy that violated every principle of defensive warfare in our tactical manuals. The display showed Admiral's proposed battle plan, with human and hegemony forces coordinated in a formation that looked more like a hunting pack than a defensive screen. Instead of protecting fixed positions, the joint fleet would abandon the colony entirely and position itself to attack Devourer forces during their approach phase. "Let them have the empty infrastructure," Admiral had said. "We'll take their ships." Ra studied the tactical display with growing alarm. She wanted to sacrifice the colony. She wanted to evacuate the colony completely and use the infrastructure as bait for a trap that would eliminate the Devourer threat permanently. Not just repel their attack on this system, but destroy their capability to attack any system. This explanation carried undertones of reluctant appreciation for strategic thinking that operated on entirely different principles from normal galactic military doctrine. The evacuation was completed in 18 hours, faster than any civilian displacement operation in hegemony records. Humans had apparently developed evacuation procedures based on their own experience with natural disasters and warfare, and their methods proved far more efficient than our standard protocols. The display showed streams of civilian transports moving through carefully planned evacuation corridors while military forces repositioned according to Admiral's hunting formation. Once the system was cleared of non-combatants, the real preparation began. Humans began modifying the abandoned infrastructure. Modifying it how? Turning it into weapons. His voice carried harmonics that suggested events beyond his species' normal comprehension. Human engineering teams spent 3 days converting mining equipment into kinetic bombardment systems, transforming orbital factories into automated defensive platforms, and rigging the entire colony infrastructure to serve as a massive tactical asset. The modifications, according to the tactical records, had been both comprehensive and creative. Human engineers had identified ways to weaponize industrial equipment that galactic military doctrine had never considered. Mining lasers became precision targeting systems, manufacturing facilities became automated missile production centers, and cargo handling equipment became kinetic projectile launchers. But the most disturbing modification was psychological. Humans had left behind what they called calling cards, messages specifically designed to enrage Devourer commanders and provoke them into making tactical errors. Ra's crystalline structure resonated with harmonic patterns of deep confusion, psychological warfare against an enemy they had never encountered. Humans had spent the evacuation period analyzing Devourer tactical patterns from previous attacks and had developed psychological profiles based on observed behavior. They concluded that Devourer commanders were susceptible to certain types of provocation and had designed their messages to exploit those weaknesses. The psychological warfare component had been startlingly effective. When Devourer forces arrived and began their standard reconnaissance, they found not a terrified colony preparing desperate defenses, but taunting messages that challenged their competence, questioned their courage, and invited them to demonstrate their combat capabilities against worthy opponents. The Devourers took the bait completely. Instead of conducting their usual systematic infrastructure destruction, they began an aggressive search for the forces that had dared to challenge them. Patterns shifted to colors associated with predatory satisfaction, which led them directly into Admiral's trap. The tactical display showed Devourer ships moving through the abandoned colony infrastructure, searching for the human forces that had left such provocative messages. As they spread out to cover more territory, they moved into positions where the modified industrial equipment could target them effectively. The battle lasted 47 minutes, continued. In that time, joint human hegemony forces destroyed 17 Devourer ships, captured 4 more intact, and eliminated approximately 60% of the Devourer forces that had been threatening the entire Outer Rim. But the tactical victory, according to testimony, had been less significant than the strategic revelation it provided about human psychological architecture. During the battle, I observed human crew members operating under stress conditions that would have incapacitated most galactic species. But they weren't just maintaining functionality. They were improving their performance. Ra leaned forward, her recording crystals pulsing with increased intensity. Improving how? Human tactical responses became more efficient as combat intensity increased. Their reaction times decreased, their coordination improved, and their strategic thinking became more creative. They were literally evolving their capabilities in real time during active combat. The phenomenon, according to the battle recordings, had been both consistent and unprecedented. Human personnel demonstrated enhanced cognitive function under extreme stress, improved physical coordination during high-threat situations, and increased creativity and problem-solving when facing novel challenges. But the most remarkable observation was their emotional state during combat. Most species experience fear, anger, or survival instinct under battlefield conditions. Humans experience something our translators couldn't properly render into any known language. Paused to access his personal files, searching for the correct terminology. The closest approximation would be combative joy, but that doesn't capture the psychological complexity. Humans seem to find deep satisfaction in successfully overcoming dangerous challenges, particularly when protecting others or defending principles they valued. The veteran's description painted a picture of human psychology that operated according to principles unlike any known sapient development model. They weren't just willing to risk their lives for strategic objectives. They were energized by the opportunity to do so. Following the successful operation, human hegemony joint forces had been deployed against increasingly challenging threats throughout the galaxy. In every case, human tactical innovations had proven decisive, but the psychological observations had become more disturbing with each engagement. Humans demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't have been possible for their level of technological development. They consistently outperformed species with superior equipment, more advanced training, and centuries more experience in interstellar warfare. Ra consulted her memory matrix, trying to reconcile the tactical accounts with established models of combat effectiveness. Superior genetics. No, superior psychology. Humans had evolved cognitive architecture that treated existential threats as optimization challenges. The more dangerous their situation became, the more creative and effective their responses became. Activated another display showing comparative performance metrics from joint operations. In every engagement, human forces achieved tactical objectives with lower casualty rates, shorter mission durations, and more comprehensive enemy defeat than projections indicated should have been possible. The data painted a picture of human military effectiveness that exceeded theoretical maximums based on their technological capabilities and training regimens. Human units consistently performed at levels that suggested cognitive enhancement or technological augmentation, but medical scans revealed no artificial modifications. During a joint operation in the Vega system, I witnessed something that changed my fundamental understanding of what humans are capable of achieving. The Vega operation had involved a rescue mission to extract hegemony civilians from a planet occupied by hostile forces using advanced defensive technologies. Standard tactical doctrine suggested the mission was impossible without overwhelming force superiority and acceptable casualty rates exceeding 50%. Admiral's team completed the extraction with zero friendly casualties and minimal civilian losses, using tactics that violated every principle of combat engineering in our databases. His voice carried undertones of profound respect. They didn't overcome the enemy defenses. They convinced the enemy defenses to defeat themselves. The human approach had involved psychological manipulation of the occupying forces' command structure, tactical deception that caused enemy units to engage each other instead of rescue forces, and strategic use of the enemy's own defensive systems against their intended targets. Humans had spent 2 days analyzing the occupying forces' communication patterns, command protocols, and tactical procedures. Then, they inserted false information into enemy networks that caused their defensive systems to identify each other as hostile targets. Ra's harmonic output shifted to frequencies associated with amazed disbelief. They turned the enemy's weapons against themselves. More than that, they turned the enemy's tactical intelligence against their operational capabilities. By the time human rescue teams reached the civilian population, the occupying force had essentially eliminated itself through friendly fire incidents triggered by compromised communication protocols. The Vega operation had established human forces as the premier tactical specialists in galactic military operations, but it had also revealed psychological capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about sapient development. After the mission, I requested a private meeting with Admiral. I needed to understand how humans had developed such sophisticated warfare capabilities without developing the psychological trauma that typically accompanies extended combat experience. The meeting had taken place in Admiral's quarters aboard the UES Retribution, a space that reflected human aesthetic preferences for functional simplicity combined with subtle artistic elements. Had expected to find a hardened warrior displaying the emotional scars common to veteran soldiers across the galaxy. Admiral was reading poetry when I arrived, ancient human literature translated into modern standard but preserving the original emotional content. She offered me tea and asked about my family, my hopes for post-war reconstruction. The conversation had revealed a psychological architecture that every model of combat stress and warrior psychology in galactic psychological databases. Humans compartmentalize their cognitive functions in ways that allow them to maintain emotional sensitivity and creative thinking while operating in combat environments that would psychologically damage most other species. Admiral had explained that human military training included extensive psychological conditioning designed not to suppress emotional responses, but to integrate them productively with tactical thinking. Human soldiers learned to use fear as a tactical enhancement, anger as a strategic motivator, and compassion as an operational objective. She told me that humans fight most effectively when they're fighting for something they love rather than against something they hate. Their tactical superiority comes from emotional investment in positive outcomes rather than simple aggression against enemies. The psychological profile that emerged from their conversation had painted a picture of a species that had evolved to find meaning and satisfaction in overcoming challenges for the benefit of their communities and ideals. Humans don't just tolerate warfare. Under the right circumstances, they find it fulfilling. Ra's crystalline structure pulsed with harmonic patterns associated with deep contemplation. They enjoy violence. No, they enjoy victory over threats to things they value. Violence is simply a tool they're willing to use when necessary, but it's not the source of their satisfaction. Clarification carried the weight of careful observation and analysis. Humans derive psychological satisfaction from successfully protecting others, overcoming challenges, and achieving objectives they consider worthy of effort. The distinction, according to Admiral's explanation, was crucial to understanding human psychological architecture. Humans who fight for personal gain or simple aggression typically perform poorly and suffer psychological damage. Humans who fight to protect their communities and ideals perform at levels that exceed the theoretical limits of their individual capabilities. During the final joint operation of Sussignment, against a species called the Reavers who had been conducting systematic genocide in the Far Rim, human psychological capabilities had been demonstrated at levels that fundamentally challenged galactic understanding of sapient potential. The Reavers had eliminated 7 colonial species and were moving toward more heavily populated systems. Traditional hegemony intervention had failed because Reaver tactics specifically targeted civilian populations to demoralize military resistance. The human response to this tactical challenge had been swift and absolute. Admiral's reaction to the genocide reports was unlike anything I had observed in 20 years of military service. Her emotional state shifted to something our translators called focused rage, but that doesn't capture the controlled intensity of her psychological response. Human forces had developed and implemented a strategic response to the Reaver genocide campaign that eliminated the entire Reaver military capability within 6 months. Not defeated, not repelled, eliminated completely. Humans didn't just stop the genocide. They made it impossible for the Reavers to continue existing as an aggressive force. Every Reaver military installation, every Reaver command ship, every Reaver weapon manufacturing facility was either captured or destroyed. But the most remarkable aspect of the human response had been its precision. Human forces eliminated Reaver military capabilities while minimizing harm to Reaver civilian populations. They separated the aggressive elements from the general population and offered integration opportunities for Reavers willing to abandon their genocidal practices. The campaign had demonstrated human capability for strategic planning and tactical execution at levels that exceeded anything in galactic military history, while maintaining ethical standards that preserved the possibility of post-conflict reconciliation. When I asked Admiral how humans could maintain such ethical precision while conducting total warfare, her answer changed my understanding of what sapient life could become under optimal evolutionary pressure. Admiral had explained that human ethical systems had evolved alongside their aggressive capabilities, creating a psychological architecture that enhanced rather than limited their effectiveness in conflicts involving existential threats to innocence. "We fight harder when we fight honorably," she had said. "Our tactical effectiveness comes from moral clarity, not from moral compromise. Humans perform best when we're certain we're protecting something worthy of protection." The conversation had concluded with Admiral's assessment of galactic civilization's future strategic requirements. She predicted that the galaxy would face increasingly sophisticated external threats that would require adaptive tactical responses and innovative strategic thinking. Traditional defensive doctrines based on technological superiority would prove inadequate. Finished his final drink and stood once more, his massive frame casting familiar shadows as he prepared to conclude his testimony. That was 7 years ago. Every prediction Admiral made has proven accurate. External threats have continued to evolve and adapt, requiring increasingly sophisticated responses from galactic defense forces. "And humans have continued to serve as tactical specialists?" Ra asked. "Humans have become essential to galactic security, not just as tactical specialists, but as strategic innovators, psychological warfare experts, and diplomatic negotiators for situations involving hostile external forces. The veterans' patterns shifted to colors associated with profound respect and lasting gratitude. The Hegemony Council now considers human participation mandatory for any military operation involving existential threats. But according to final assessment, the most significant development had been the gradual adoption of human-influenced tactical doctrine throughout hegemony military forces. Human tactical innovations have improved the effectiveness of all galactic species in conflict situations. Their psychological training methods have reduced combat stress trauma across the entire military. Their strategic planning principles have enhanced defensive capabilities for every member species. Ra's recording crystals captured not just the words, but the emotional resonances that gave them their full meaning. So humans have improved galactic civilizations' defensive capabilities. Humans have improved galactic civilizations' understanding of what sapient life can achieve when properly motivated and ethically directed. His final observation carried the weight of a career spent witnessing the transformation of galactic strategic thinking. They proved that aggressive capability and ethical behavior are not mutually exclusive, that tactical superiority can serve moral objectives, and that the greatest warriors are those who fight for the protection of others rather than the advancement of themselves. The veteran warrior moved toward the cantina's exit, his testimony complete, but his thoughts clearly still occupied with the implications of what he had witnessed. I requested this interview because other species deserve to understand what humans truly represent. They are not a threat to galactic peace. They are peace's most effective guardians. Ra remained at their table, her crystalline structure still resonating with harmonic frequencies as she processed the full implications of what she had recorded. The story she had captured was more than historical testimony. It was a fundamental revision of galactic understanding about the relationship between aggressive capability and civilized behavior. "Commander," she called as reached the exit. "One final question. If you could go back to that first contact situation knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" The veteran paused, his four eyes focusing on distant memories that had shaped the galaxy's current strategic reality. "I would have approached humanity not as subjects for integration, but as potential allies in protecting galactic civilization from threats we hadn't yet learned to recognize." His mandibles clicked in what was definitely amusement this time. "And I would have brought better wine to the first meeting. Humans appreciate good alcohol and meaningful conversation more than displays of technological superiority." As departed, leaving Vexara alone with her recordings and her transformed understanding of galactic history, the cantina's normal activities resumed around her. Other species continued their conversations, unaware that they had just witnessed the documentation of humanity's true place in galactic civilization. The recordings she had captured would eventually reshape galactic understanding of human psychology, strategic thinking, and the relationship between aggressive capability and ethical behavior. But for now, she sat quietly, contemplating the remarkable species that had taught the galaxy's greatest military minds that the most effective warriors were those who fought not for conquest, but for the protection of others. In the years that followed, as external threats continued to test galactic civilization's adaptive capabilities, humanity's role as guardian species would expand beyond military operations to include diplomatic innovation, technological development, and strategic planning for challenges that had not yet emerged. They would continue to demonstrate that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know what deserved protection and the capability to provide it effectively. The story Ra had recorded would become required study for military academies, diplomatic corps, and strategic planning institutes throughout the galaxy. It would serve as documentation of the day galactic civilization learned that its greatest allies were not the species most similar to themselves, but the species most different, the apex predators who had chosen to direct their capabilities toward the protection of others rather than the advancement of themselves. And in quiet cantinas throughout the galaxy, veterans of joint operations with human forces would share their own stories of the remarkable species that had taught them the true meaning of honorable warfare, ethical strength, and the profound satisfaction that came from fighting for something greater than personal survival.